especially in the reporting, to understand. Okay, so hello everybody. Lovely to see so many people here. This is the first of two sessions that we will be having as part of our creative and professional writing project. So I'm Meg Jensen, and alongside Kate Scott and Sarah Upstone and Peter Ely, who's here also tonight, we have been working on a project for the last several years, the Creative and Professional Writing Project, which is funded by the Vice Chancellor of Kingston University. And the aim of the project is to work towards improving employability for our students, particularly in the creative industries. So to that end, we developed this really fantastic industry board where we have a number of different industry leaders in the creative industries, and we have met regularly to discuss the key skills and employability skills, and both soft skills and specific skills that people will need, that our students will need in order to write professionally in the future. So that encompasses all aspects of writing, publishing, creative writing, but also technical writing, bid writing, everywhere where there's a chance to make a living as a writer. We have tried to find people who can help tell us how best to train our students to be able to do so. And a big aspect of that is also to help the industry leaders themselves who want to be able to expand inclusivity, increase inclusivity within their own industries. So if we can train our students to be the very best people to be chosen for these jobs, then it's, you know, a win-win for everybody. So tonight we have asked two of our board members to come and talk with us about careers in publishing. So they are, sorry, I have my wrong thing in front of me, sorry. So they're Jeremy Trevathan, who you see with his headset on there and his glasses. That's Jeremy Trevathan. Jeremy is publisher at Macmillan. He's responsible for the shape, the direction, the profitability of the adult publishing lists at Macmillan in the UK. And I will introduce both Jeremy and Kate very briefly because they'll be talking more about their careers. And indeed, that's the point of the evening. And also with us tonight is Kate Rizzo. So Kate is the rights director of the Green Heaton agency. She is in charge of translation rights for Green and Heaton, and she works closely with sub-agents in territories and directly with publishers in Brazil, Germany, Israel, Italy, Netherlands, Portugal, Scandinavia, and Spain. And she's been working for various important literary agencies for a long time, so it'll be great to talk to her. And introducing these two is yet another one of our wonderful board members, which is Professor Brian Bravati. So I'll say a little bit more about Brian because otherwise you won't hear about him, about his career. But following a 20-year academic career at the Institute of Contemporary British History and at Kingston University, Brian has edited or written more than 14 books, hundreds of articles, and was appointed as the youngest professor of contemporary history and human rights in the UK. He left to run human rights organizations and works as a mentor to private sector and social enterprises, civic leaders, and politicians all around the world. So that gives you, and you know, basically has made his living through writing. Please forgive, my cat is coming up to say hello, Brian. And Brian basically has made his living through writing in lots of very interesting ways. So we'll be talking with him in the follow-up session, which is on the 10th of March, but we'll tell you more about that later. So I turn over now to you, Brian.
Thanks very much, Meg. Just to put it in a broader context, and picking up on a few of the things that Meg said about the project, one of the objectives of the professional writing project is to think about ways in which when we started the project, what we saw very much as a skills shortage in a number of key industries, in the creative industries, but also in the civil service and in the third sector and the development sector where I work now, could be addressed by building curriculum in universities to bring students through who had specific professional writing skills. Now, that objective is still there, but in between, I'm not sure if anyone noticed, but the world went completely insane and changed in really significant and interesting ways. And we need to factor in our thinking around professional writing, the post-COVID world, the building back better world, working from home, working remotely, mass unemployment, people having to reinvent their careers midway through their careers in ways that 2 or 3 years ago, when we started thinking about these issues, they had no idea they were going to have to do. So when we started this process about a career in publishing, that looked in a particular way like possibly going in to an office in potentially central London, in Jeremy's office, in Kate's office, and working with a group of people in a room. It's going to be different. We don't know yet how it's going to be different. Secondly, there are going to be many fewer jobs in that space, so competition for them is going to be ever more ferocious, but that means the entrepreneurial space for inventing yourself as a freelance editor, as a freelance reader, as a content provider is now huge, and you are finding companies will be much more open to working with you in that way. So the career in publisher space is going to be different. The way publishers recruit is going to be different, and the way they work is going to be different post-COVID. And possibly that means publishing might become, in some ways, more inclusive, dare I say. And so one of the things we want to explore tonight is how publishing can be more inclusive, how it could be more open to flexible ways of working, and possibly more open to entrepreneurs and startups. And to begin with that, what we do is ask both of you 2 initial questions, and then we might come back to the inclusion and the real big change question at the end. But first of all, we'd like you to talk a little bit about yourselves, how you got into publishing, what you're doing now and how that works. And it's going to be impossible not to say a little bit about the difference for yourself about how that's working post-COVID, but also what you're looking for. So we've got a lot of people online. A lot of them have, the people who've been saying who they are, a lot of them are third-year undergraduates, will be looking for jobs. A lot of them are looking for jobs now, trying to break into this industry, which is infinitely appealing to so many people. What do they need to bring in terms of professional writing skills? What are you missing? What do you need in what you do that could be reflected in this curriculum that we're developing, but also in the way they might present themselves to work with you? And then I think we'll come back and look at the big post-COVID world in the context of inclusion at the end, if that's okay. Okay.
Sounds good. Yep.
So Kate, do you want to kick off first? Because once Jeremy starts talking, it's going to be the entire evening gone. So, Kate, would you like to kick off first? Those first 2 questions. How did you get into publishing? What do you do? And what are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of got into publishing almost by accident. I mean, I was an English major at university, and it was kind of like, well, what do you do with this? And for me, I think reading has always been a part of my life. So I was living in New York City at the time when I went to university and did not want to leave the city. And I was like, well, I'm going to try and find a job in publishing. And so I sent out a lot of resumes and CVs and applied to a lot of jobs at the time. And eventually, though, I did get a response from a literary agency there. And so I started off answering the phone, you know, that you've reached the agency and who can I put you through to? So that was all I was doing, was kind of answering the phone, seeing the different manuscripts that were coming in for the agency, reading the things that we represented, and really kind of just seeing the other agents work. And, you know, I kind of moved from, as I thought of myself, as front desk girl to assistant to the president of the literary agency. And in that role, I was very much responsible for all of her correspondence. And so seeing her speak to her authors, sell the books to publishers, negotiate contracts, you know, the whole kind of gamut of what a literary agent does. And while I was there, I really kind of discovered, you know, how vast the world of publishing is. You know, it's not just someone writes a book and it goes to the publishing house. You know, there's a lot of steps in that process. And I kind of personally very much love the idea of being on the agency side, and in that idea of a writer having an idea and then seeing them be able to make a book of that, and seeing that get sold and published and designed and all those things. So I've always remained on the agency side. And kind of being in that role, I also discovered what is known as translation rights. And that is basically where, alongside trying to find a English language publisher for our authors, we also look to sell their work into as many languages as possible. So my job in every day is corresponding with publishers in Germany or France and Italy, and trying to match, you know, our stable of authors at Green and Heaton with publishers in those different markets. So it's a big job in some ways, and kind of it's always different. So it's a lot about, you know, knowing the markets, knowing what people are looking for, and kind of trying to match, you know, make those connections. I think that's what I do every day.
So it's almost a classic career story in a way, putting yourself out there, trying different things, sending your resume to lots of people, getting an entry-level job and working your way up.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, part of what I always have loved about being the agency, on the agency side, is, and I think, I mean, Jeremy will probably say this too in some ways, I mean, publishing, it's always what you make it. And so, you know, I think one of the first things I learned, and kind of have always kind of continued, is you just say yes to everything. You know, if someone asks you to read something, if someone asks you to come to some book launch, if someone asks you to do anything, you're just like, yes, 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 yes. And that's kind of how you just learn more. And then of course you're able to eventually channel what your real interest is, whether that is editorial or contracts or any of those kind of different aspects of the industry.
Okay. So we'll come back to you in a second, Kate, and pick up that second question particularly. But Jeremy, what's your story, sir?
So my story is that I was at university. I was of the generation of people who went to university basically because you could take another 3 years of taking it easy, and you got government grants to let you do that. And so I studied politics and philosophy with no sense, at Hull University, with no sense of what I was going to do with it. And then a friend of mine at university, his sister, was doing what I think was the first publishing course in England, which was the course at Oxford Polytechnic, as it was then called, which is now, of course, Oxford Brookes University. And she was doing it as an undergraduate. And when I was scouting around towards my third year as an undergraduate at Hull, I basically started thinking, I've got to sort out what I'm going to do. I love reading. I love reading everything. I mean, I love reading nonfiction and fiction. Publishing sounds good. And what was the great promise of the course at Oxford Poly was that they guaranteed that everyone who did the course got a job in publishing. So I thought that's the thing to do. So I actually did a postgraduate course in publishing at Oxford Polytechnic. I went to visit my friend's sister, Karina, and I stayed with her for a week first and just shadowed her around the college, and decided that I loved the sound of it. So I did this postgraduate course for a year where we did everything that you would do in a publishing company, but theoretically, if you know what I mean. The only hands-on thing that they had was an imprint that was run by the third-year undergraduates and the postgraduate students. And they literally published books. So they bought and published books and put them together and printed, and they had some successes as a publishing company. So I did that, and I was all bright and ready to start my career as a shining editor, ready to go out having cocktails and laughter with agents and authors and having a great time, and discovered that it wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. And I did get a job in publishing, but my first job in publishing was as a production editor for Blackwell Scientific, which was a academic science publisher. And I worked in the journals division on things like the Journal of Dermatology, which reproduced pictures of people with terrible skin conditions, which were pretty horrific, some of them, I've got to say. And basically I got, it was interesting because I wanted to be an editor, but I discovered that I loved production, actually. And so I ended up as a senior production editor at Blackwell Scientific. I then hopped over to Oxford University Press because I was living in Oxford at the time. And I got a job as a production controller at Oxford University, working in their, I can't remember what they used to call it, but not their academic publishing, more the trade end of what Oxford University published at the time. So history books and things like that. And then from there, I moved to Penguin in London, and I worked my way up to be the production director of Viking, which is an imprint within the Penguin Group. And I was there in 1989 when we published Satanic Verses. So I was the person pressing the button when we were reprinting. I mean, we were literally reprinting 100,000 copies every half hour at one point. So I did that. And then while I was doing that job, I started working closely with the subsidiary rights department of Penguin. So subsidiary rights, a bit like an agency, what a publishing company does is they buy the rights from an author to publish the book. But if the author and agent will allow it, and if the publisher pays enough money for it, the author and agent may also sell you other rights. So they may actually sell you those translation rights that Kate was just talking about, and you pay more money to buy them. They may, although it's very rare, sell you dramatic rights or whatever. So I was in the department. So I was working with the department that within the publishing company, within Penguin, sold on those rights to other organizations. And I was working with them as a production person because with 4-color books, the translation rights people try and sell rights to foreign languages, but then also sell them the idea of printing their edition along with the English language edition, and you just have a change of printing plate for the language, and it allows you to build up an enormous print run, which gives you economies of scale, which means that everyone has much cheaper books produced, which means that you can do them at lower prices or have higher margins on the book. So I was working with them a lot and going to Frankfurt Book Fair and sitting in on meetings and calculating unit costs for these people, but enjoying the world of people basically talking about books, because that's what was going on in production. We were talking about the elements of a book. In rights, I was starting to see a world where you talk about the actual, books to individuals, and you persuade someone else that you love a book, and then and that they'll love it too. So I eventually hopped over from production to become a junior person in the rights team. So I had to go back down to the bottom, and then I worked my way up again, and then I was headhunted to go to Time Life at that point, which had a thing called a book club, which I don't think exists anymore. A book club was a closed world where a closed financial world where a group of people, you joined a club, you got books at a lower price, the organisation produced a catalogue each month and sold you these books at a lower price. So I worked there, and again, this was a world of talking to people and selling people books. And then from there, I was poached by Reader's Digest to go and launch a publishing list where my experience doing production and co-editions worked incredibly well with them, with the market research that they had for their readership, which was all about gardening and crafts and things like that. And so I developed a list there of books. So I was becoming more like a publisher. But then I was headhunted by Macmillan. So this was now 25 years ago. I've been in publishing for 40 years, so you can tell how long it took me to get to this stage. And then I came to Macmillan as the rights director at Macmillan. So I went, took a step back slightly, but to be more senior at Macmillan. And I was rights director for 5 years, and then I was asked to become publisher of Macmillan, the hardback imprint. So what I did there was I actually skipped a role because I'd never been an editor. And there's a difference between an editor and a publisher. Some editors are really good publishers too. Some editors never become terribly good publishers, and some publishers have never been editors, and I'm one of those. And the point about the publisher's role is that you, either with a small list of books that's your list of books that you acquire from authors and agents, or if it's with a team of people who you are managing, and you're managing a list that's a list of editors who are acquiring and commissioning books from authors and agents. Your role is to sort of figure out what are the books that we want to buy, what's the shape of the list we want to publish, what are the areas of the market that we want to publish in, what should we be paying for them to authors and agents, how we should produce them, what price we should publish them at, all sorts of aspects about the publishing of the book, what we do for marketing, what we do liaising with your marketing and publicity teams, what we do to make all that happen. And ultimately, you're sort of responsible for the bottom line of that business unit. So you're almost the head of the business unit. And I now do that. So I did that with Macmillan as a hardback imprint. I then moved to become head of fiction publishing within the adult division of Macmillan. And then eventually I become head of all the publishing of, when I say adult division, it sounds like I publish erotica, but actually we do publish all sorts of other things too. And I'm now head of all the publishing for grown-ups that we do at Macmillan. So that means Macmillan Pan, which is our paperback imprint, Picador, which is our literary imprint, Tor, which is our science fiction and fantasy imprint, Mantle, which is our sort of reading group imprint, and Bluebird, which is our probably our most recently founded imprint and probably our most successful launch ever. We publish Joe Wicks and the Pinch of Nom ladies with these cookery books and things like that. So I publish right across the range from Alan Hollinghurst to Ken Follett. I published Ken Follett myself, through to Hillary Clinton, who we just signed up yesterday, which was announced. She's writing a thriller with a crime writer called Louise Penny, and we will be publishing her this autumn. So that's what I do. And what I would say is that it's all about communication. It's about relationships and communication, because publishing is not an industry like, publishing is a creative industry, and the thing about all creative industries is that it's not like you're producing tins of baked beans or cars. They're not, the economies of scale are not the same as you would get in other industries, and each book is actually a unique product, and it's as unique as the author who's written it. and therefore your approach to it is unique. There will be similarities across the books that you publish and what you do, but there are lots and lots of differences too. And
Jeremy, can I pause you there? Let's drill down deeper into that in a moment.
Okay.
But just going back just on that first question, just for a moment, how in the old pre-COVID model, how usual was your move from the production side across through rights into that senior management role on the publishing side? Was it a sort of more of a silo industry previously? And
yes,
is that changing? Has that changed?
Absolutely. I would say that it was very unusual. It was so unusual that what I was originally going to do was move to Penguin's offices in New York to move into rights. And it took Peter Mayer, who was then the head of Penguin globally, to allow that to happen and to sort of help me to make that happen. In the end, I didn't do that for personal circumstances, but they ended up creating the role for me in rights. So they had to create a role, and it was very unusual then. More and more and more, I've noticed that people, you get more and more. So, for instance, in our comms team now, we used to have a marketing department and a publicity department, and they each had different skills. We now have a comms department, and actually all our marketeers can do publicity and all our publicists can do marketing. And basically, a lot of the roles become more melded together. And that's happening across the board. Even as editors, we don't have assistants anymore. We don't have secretaries. We all do our own correspondence or our own. Even me, I've got an assistant to help me with my diary, but all my communication is done by me on the phone, by email, or verbally.
Right. Let's pick up more on those changes in a minute. Kate, let's go back to you first. And careers in publishing, now you're in a position to hire people, to bring people in. What are you looking for? What's the skill set? Jeremy's touched on some of the personal skills around communication, about relationship building, about being self-reliant and so on. But build on that. What role does professional writing as a discipline potentially play in building those skill sets?
I think communication is definitely key, and kind of being able to express yourself. And actually, at Green and Heaton, before all this, we had a long-running paid internship that we offered. And as part of even to get the paid internship, or even as part of hiring a new person, we do tend to actually ask our applicants to do some sort of writing test. And so for us, that tends to involve, can you take maybe a little bit about, like, if we give you a paragraph about a book and what the plot is, and kind of make that a news story. So it is about knowing how to write about how to sell something, or pick out the relevant information to convey what would need to be going into a press release or something like that. And so when we have applicants do that, it's about seeing that they can pick out what are the most important details, but we also are checking things, very basic things like grammar and spelling, and we all thankfully have spell check for our emails, but make sure you use it. So those are the very basic things that you look for, and on the skills app, like that, I guess probably technical skill in some ways, but a lot of it is, if when we interview people or we read people's cover letters, or you look at their CV, it's about seeing maybe that they're interested in publishing, they're interested in books, or they're interested in learning something, and kind of expressing kind of that passion, whether you've been a waitress or a bartender or you've worked in a bookshop, it doesn't matter. It's kind of just knowing that you are able to, hold a job and communicate with people, and kind of have that, almost like that service aspect, because certainly as an agency, we are serving our authors and a need to provide them a service. So that kind of is it, I think.
Okay. Thanks.
It's hard to say
Well,
sometimes, but a lot of it is, I think, just being comfortable and kind of trying to be yourself. And I think that is what comes across certainly initially in an interview or anything you write when you're applying for a job.
Right. But presumably a lot of your time is still spent actually looking at submissions by authors who want your agency to represent them. So there's the whole set of skills around rights and contracts.
Yeah.
And so there's a technical, legal, and commercial dimension to it. But there's also that sense of when you decide to take someone on as a writer, can you teach that, or do you just learn that as you go along?
I think you learn that as you go along. And I think, if you're interested in publishing, first thing you should be doing is kind of just reading everything, and that is what's on the bestseller list. That's what's winning prizes or shortlisted for prizes. Even if you don't like it, it's like, I read a lot of romantic comedies. They're not my favorite, but do you know what? They're actually very entertaining. Or I am reading big histories or science books. And so you kind of learn the different elements that these types of narratives or stories must include to kind of be something that a publisher would want to buy. And so actually at the agency, we all take turns reading the unsolicited submissions that come in each week. And there also tends to be a correlation between the better written cover emails tend to be the better written manuscripts. And again, that's kind of, the pitches that are geared towards what the agency does or what an agent has said he or she might be looking for. But again, that's like you learn maybe what feels better than the rest just through reading more and more and more. But that's also to be said, like in some ways, I always feel like there's a publisher for a lot of books out there. And, someone like Macmillan looks for certain kinds of books, but there's so many different kinds of, kind of publishing houses looking for very specific things. And sometimes it's just about getting that right fit.
Right. But, and that makes absolute sense. So if you're looking for a job in a publishing house like Jeremy's, to research the publishing house. But if you're looking for a job with an agent, would you expect someone to have researched carefully who the kind of authors are that you represent as an agency, what your list looks like, and so on, to actually put that kind of time in?
Most definitely. And that's always, I think, a thoughtful thing to be doing if you're going to go speak to someone. It's just look at their website. And, even if you haven't been able to read the book yourself, thankfully, courtesy of Amazon, they sometimes have a look inside the book and you can read 2 or 3 pages at least, and just kind of see a little bit maybe what that author is writing or, kind of, I know a lot of agencies on their websites now have blogs or kind of news story sections. So maybe just take a look at that because that will show you what's the latest information and maybe what just published. And it's always nice to reference that and to show an agency, books that you've loved or things that you've learned from your reading.
Okay. And Jeremy, so both at a higher level where you're making those kind of senior appointments, obviously there's a whole process, but we're really talking about how you can break in, how you can get that first job in publishing. And what do people need to bring to you to stand out from what will be hundreds of thousands of applicants? And what kind of skill sets, once they're in, do they need to demonstrate in order to make the kind of meteoric 40-year rise that that you achieved?
Exactly. So Kate's absolutely right that the covering letter is actually more important than many people think. I would say that the CV, particularly at entry level, is we'll look at it, but it's probably not the most important thing that we're looking at, particularly now.
Will you look at it, or will a machine look at it?
Oh no, we will look at the CV because there'll be pieces of information now that will be interesting too. But we're sort of assuming that we're assuming an interest in books and in reading, and in the covering letter, what we're looking for probably is not probably, I know what I'm talking about. What we're looking for is succinct communication. So in other words, to write a 3-page letter as an application is too long, it's too wordy. We're looking for a succinct letter which explains your interest in reading. One of the things you were asking Kate earlier if it's a good idea to show some knowledge of the books that we publish. I would say that that's a really good thing to do. And even so, I remember that we once hired someone because they wrote about some of the books that we published and said, and not very long, it was just short things about it, but there were 2 of the books, and then there was one book which had been a huge bestseller for us, and they said they'd read it, but they weren't so sure about it and the reasons why, and that we gave, eventually that person got the job because basically they were already showing a critical judgment about what they read and what it was that they liked about what they read and what it was that they didn't like. And actually what they didn't like about it, it's, if you think about it, that's quite an important part of the job, particularly in editorial, because an editor is probably spending a lot of time, I would say an editor is spending at least 60% of their time reading stuff that unfortunately they're going to say no to. And they have to figure out what it is that they like about what they read and why they like it. And as you get more and more experienced, that becomes more and more sort of a sort of carapace of knowledge that you gain about why is it that this book. And I've had senior editors. Well, famously, there's a woman called Maria Raitt who is our publisher on Mantle, and she was sent Room by Emma Donoghue, and she read it and she knew it was going to be huge, but she knew that she didn't like it because it was too dark for her, and she handed it to this other editor who worked in Picador and said, I know your taste is much darker than mine, and I think you'll really like this, and I think it's really commercial. And Sam Humphries, who was the editor, bought it, and we published it, and it was a huge bestseller. So I would say that. But having said that, there are lots of ways to get into publishing where you don't have to, express. It's really good to talk about the books you read and why you like them and why you don't. But there's lots of roles in publishing. I'm a great advocate for saying, if you want to get into publishing, just get a job in any publishing company, even if it's just to be the receptionist, because once you're in the building, you will start to get to know people in the office. You'll start to understand how it works. You'll start to, you'll meet other people within the business. You'll see jobs when they're posted up internally, and you'll get in like that. And then the most important thing is probably, so there's the cover letter, which, as I say, needs to be succinct and clear, not too wordy, not too long, but just authentic. It needs to be, don't try and be something that you're not. Try and describe yourself in a authentic way and describe why it is that you want the job.
Yeah, and I think just why you want to work in the industry.
Yeah, exactly.
I think, like, I didn't know translation rights was a job you could have until I just started working at an agency, and there's loads of jobs in publishing houses that, beyond editorial, that are much more technical, perhaps. It's not necessarily about reading and evaluating manuscripts. I mean, there's design and there's a lot of different spaces.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's build on that and think about the difference post-COVID, but also how that might impact on the problems of inclusion within publishing, what your particular companies do to address inclusion. But also I want to open up to everybody who's been kind enough to come and listen. And if you'd like to put a question, the easiest way of managing these things in my experience is if you put a question into the chat, and then we'll take 3 or 4 questions when we come to questions at the end, and we'll try and work our way through as many as we can, assuming we get more. We've got one in the chat already, which I'll come to in a moment, or you might want to respond to in what you say now. But This question of inclusion, we've talked a lot about the covering letter, the way you approach companies, trying to get an entry-level job, but even getting to that bar, thinking that I can get a job in that space, that I could apply for that job, can be there can be barriers to that kind of inclusion. And publishing, like many other industries, has got a reputation for being a place that is dominated by public school educated white men. And how is that true in your experience? And if it is true, or even partially true, what are your companies doing to break down those barriers and open it as a career open to all talents? And what difference has COVID made as well? So quite a lot there. Kate, please.
Yeah, I would say, I think, as I say, Green and Heaton have long run a paid internship before that was an accepted thing, you know, so we've kind of always made sure that we're trying to pay a living wage to, you know, interns that often did become full-time hires. And for us, the inclusion is also about making sure the list of writers that we represent reflect the way the broader society looks, which is sometimes, you know, easier said than done. And I think, you know, we've been running a project that we call the Green Door for the last 2 years, where again, we, at least twice a year, we haven't been able to do it because of COVID. And actually we've been talking about how to best do that, where we invite aspiring writers to come to where our office is in Shepherd's Bush, and we let them pitch us their manuscripts, and we kind of go through them with them and then kind of give feedback. And, you know, at some point, perhaps we represent the author, but a lot of it is just helping them understand and think about how to craft a story, and kind of the elements you need to put into that, and how you would approach agents, etc. So that's kind of one thing we've been doing as an agency. And I think we're also just always mindful of the submissions that come in, and you know, perhaps not everyone has come from, you know, the same background as us or myself, but maybe that means we need to give editorial feedback, and maybe nothing comes of it, but we're offering that from our own time as much as possible.
There's a question actually in the chat, which is about experience in another country, and how knowing another market and those kind of skills. I mean, do you think that I mean, it's not really inclusion exclusion, but do you think certainly in the rights context, having those kind of experiences of a different marketplace could actually be quite a bankable skill in a job hunt in the UK? Completely.
And you know, a lot of when you talk about kind of public schools and kind of the perception of British publishing, you know, for me as an American, I didn't have that. Like, you know, so it didn't mean anything to me when people would start dropping stuff like information that I'm like, okay, I don't know what that, you know, those kind of social cues that can be intimidating. I just was so unaware of as an American, because it's like, I don't know what you're talking about. So in some ways that did make it easier for me to kind of just do my own thing, and kind of like, I'm here to do my job and this is what I'm doing. And I think obviously if you speak different languages, or, you know, you're familiar with different cultures, like that is something that in terms of the agents' work and rights departments and publishing houses, you know, when you're trying to sell a book to different markets, people that can understand those markets because they come from them is kind of a real asset.
Right. Okay, there's another question that's popped up for you, which is interesting, which is, where have you looked for aspiring writers to pitch in the past? So do you think COVID might change where you might look for people to represent?
I think the biggest change, and I don't know if COVID necessarily has changed this as much as, you know, we find a lot of our writers through social media, and it's because they're following other writers that we see, or they're, you know, talking about novels they're writing, and, you know, using the right hashtags. And, you know, we run hashtag ask an agent, things like that. So actually, you know, obviously the emails is electronic, so kind of that distance is fine. But it's really just, I don't know, if social media has been a real, I think, big thing. And also there's kind of that proliferation, certainly online, of kind of writing journals and magazines, and kind of, you do engage as an agent, you know, we do spend time looking for things that sound interesting or seem to be getting a lot of, you know, tweets or something. You're like, who's writing that? You want to know more about that person. And if you kind of chime with what they're saying or what their voice is, how their voice sounds in writing, you're kind of like, let's see if you want an agent and hope that they respond.
Yeah. Jeremy, I'd like you to think about the post-COVID changes, but also there's a question about what academic qualifications should appear on a CV, which to an extent touches on the inclusion question.
Absolutely,
Are
yeah.
there certain, box ticking exercises, English at Oxford with a first, and you get an interview, that are really going on?
So I'll just go back a little bit, because the original question was about, is it still being run by old white men like me? What I would say is that I take the long perspective, because I've been, as I say, in the industry for 40 years. It used to be pretty exclusively old white men with degrees from Oxford and Cambridge who ran everything. If you look around the industry now, women are much higher represented than they were. LGBTQ plus there's a very high proportion of LGBTQ plus people in publishing now. There isn't enough BAME people, and it's one of the things that we're all working on. And also there isn't enough, there's a class bias, I would say, and an educational bias. And one of the things that, so for instance, when I mentioned earlier that the CV isn't the most important document, we actually have a system now on our recruitment software where we read the CV, but actually the CV is held back originally, and we look through the letters first, and the letters are anonymized, so that we're reading everything blind, which is why the letter is so important, because how you express yourself and how you put yourself across, it becomes the key thing that we look at initially to filter out who the people we're talking to are not. So we're now not looking immediately to see if you've got a university degree. If you're articulate and you can express yourself, and you can express yourself in an interesting way about whatever it is that we're employing you to do, your letter will be the key thing about it. We will probably then look at the CV once we've narrowed things down, and we'll look at the CV and stuff like that. But we're almost actively trying not to make ourselves, over biased to people who have, for instance, degrees. And getting back to the question about employing people from abroad, absolutely. One of my best hires ever was a young German lady who, when she applied for my job, she actually came in as a temp, and then was so taken with publishing, and everyone liked her so much that they encouraged her to apply for a job as my assistant. And she applied, but in a terribly apologetic way, saying, I know I'm not going to get this because I'm German, and you'll feel that I don't know anything about British culture and writing. And I said, no, you're going to be my assistant. I don't need you to do that. You can find that all that later. She's now the editorial director at Quercus, so she's built a career in publishing, and she's a very, very good publisher and editor. So I think we're very open to experience from other industries, other countries.
The specific question is quite interesting. It's about whether to consider doing an MA versus getting real world experience. And maybe ask both of you this, because again, going back to this post-COVID question, and a lot of people are applying for MAs at the moment. They're not quite sure what's happening over the next year. It could give them a competitive advantage in the workplace. Is that true in publishing? Or will we see so much more flexible working, so much more remote working, that actually going out there, getting real world experience, as you were saying, Kate, getting a social media presence, writing, and encapsulating that in your covering letter might be a better strategy to break in, or indeed to make a living subcontracting to publishers, working freelance, rather than expect there to be so many jobs available. Kate, what do you think?
It's funny, like I was actually just thinking about this more, because also a lot of things I've noticed people doing, they're online reviewers, they're writing blogs about book reviews, and in some ways that is real world experience, whether you decide to get an MA or not. You're kind of making and evaluating a text and having an opinion about it. And so perhaps that's something to be doing alongside your coursework as you're thinking about where you want to go. I mean, I didn't get an MA in publishing, and actually I think it's funny, I don't know how popular it was, kind of even, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years ago when I was in university. But I do know people who have done it, and actually what it has allowed for and does allow some people really see is kind of where they want to end up focusing their time and energy within the industry. So, I wouldn't say it's a bad thing to be doing, because it might show you, oh, I want to work in production, I want to work in rights, I want to work in editorial, and kind of let you see a little bit of all of these things. And particularly right now where, yes, we are hiring. I mean, we hired a new agency-wide assistant kind of at the beginning of the year. So people are hiring, but if it feels like there's not that many jobs, I mean, I think perhaps an MA is a good way to keep your hand in and to kind of learn more while you're kind of hoping, well, we're all hoping for, the job market to improve.
I would say, I mean, I do think I think Kate's absolutely right. I think that an MA helps you figure out, it's part of that process of figuring out what it is you really want to do in a publishing company. But the risk that you take is that you'll still have to start at the bottom, and you'll probably still have to just find a job in a publishing house to get into publishing. So I would say that I would say, I mean, I probably shouldn't say this because I know Kingston does an MA in publishing, but I would say that it's not as influential as it used to be, partly because of this inclusion thing. It's the pool of people that we're looking at to employ is growing, and an academic qualification isn't necessarily going to be as powerful an influence on the decision to employ you as it used to be.
Okay, so generally, yes, it's a good idea to do an MA, to do an academic qualification, but things aren't as they used to be, that's necessarily going to get you a job. You've got to think about doing a lot of other things as well.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a question about self-publishing and whether the skills are transferable from self-publishing to other forms of experience in publishing. Maybe going back to our covering letter, if there's a self-publishing experience in that covering letter, how does that play?
Well, I've got to say, so one of the things that I've noticed recently is, and harking back to something Kate just said, a lot of people are now going online and starting their own book blogs or YouTube, booktube channels, and self-publishing, I think, is a similar thing. I'm not one of those. Some publishers think self-publishing is a terrible thing. I think it's absolutely fine, and I think it's another part of the publishing world, and I think it's really good that it's happening more. The more people who are reading books, the better, and I'm happy about that. The experience of self-publishing, what I would say is, it's probably really useful for the area of digital marketing, which all publishers have now, because it's largely digital marketing that you're doing when you're selling those books, and largely through Amazon. It's very different though in a publishing house, but the fact that you've done it, and the fact that you've shown the gumption to do it, to write your own book, to get it published, and all the rest of it, is actually a really good. That would be something that would make me sit up if I saw that in a letter that you wrote in to apply for a job.
Yeah, particularly if you've done everything around it to get it some attention.
Completely, yeah.
So, Kate, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, in that way, because you're thinking about what are the what are the words that are going to come up in a search that is going to make my book on, as you say, it's mostly Amazon where people are self-publishing, become like, one of those top sponsored featured books in women's fiction, or something like that. And as an agency side, looking at writers who have self-published and perhaps been success stories and then want an agent, of course, we tend to look at those a bit more closely. And sometimes the writers have found, actually, after self-publishing, they don't want an agent or a traditional publisher. They want to keep doing what they're doing.
Right.
In fact, I was just reading, there's an author called L.J. Ross, who's a hugely successful self-published author. And I was reading an interview with her earlier on today. And she was saying that basically it's not for every author. She loves all the work that she has to do and all the process that she has to go through. But she said it's not for everyone. You need to enjoy doing all that. And some authors do and some don't.
Yeah, I mean, it is another job of one, you had to write your book, and then now you have to market it all by yourself. That's a lot of work.
Exactly.
And there's a question not so much about a career in publishing as about getting published. So, Kate, if someone was pitching to you, what would be your top 3 tips to somebody pitching for you to be their agent? And Jeremy, for you to be their publisher with the manuscript, what would be your top 3 tips?
To how to write your cover letter, I think, oh geez, this is always a hard thing. Because an agent, there's so many different agents who are looking for so many different kinds of books. So if you are writing a genre or whatever, a history book or a women's fiction book or a fantasy book, make sure that you're approaching agents that are actually looking for that type of material. So, you can find that, look in your acknowledgements of some of your favorite writers. Hopefully they have thanked their agent and their publisher, and that can be a starting point. So go to the agency websites, then look up the agent, see who else they represent. And again, in your cover letter, it's always a nice thing to mention, oh, you're a fan of one of their other authors that they represent or something like that. I would also say when you're looking for an agent and you're looking at these websites, pay attention to the assistants, because they're the ones who have more time to be reading and are very actively hungry because they don't already have a stable of 100 authors. So I think, again, that kind of specific targeted cover letter that shows that you're chosen this person or this agency for a reason is very much the key. And to articulate your brief description of your novel and then just follow the submission guidelines on an agency's website is all we ask. We'll read it. You read everything.
And Jeremy, if you're pitched, if you're pitched directly rather than through an agent, is that much more difficult for someone to break through that way? Should they really be going to an agent and get the agent to pitch?
Really, yes. I mean, what I would say is that all the big publishing companies, the good thing is that there's a huge range, as Kate mentioned earlier, there's a huge range of publishers out there, and they all operate in different ways. With the big groups, I don't think any of them now take unsolicited scripts. So, and what I mean by that is scripts that haven't come from an agent. And the reason for that is mainly because there's so much material that's coming in already that's been filtered by the agent community that we just don't have the capacity to be able to have, like agencies do, to have a slush pile of material that sits there that we can go in and read. So I would say really do try and if you're coming to the big companies, check. Well, a bit like Kate said, check the publishing company whether they take unsolicited manuscripts or not. The smaller ones probably do. The other thing I would say, to echo Kate, was when you're looking for agents or publishers, don't go for the big name agent who everyone knows, because they will probably already have a full stable. And the reason why they're that well known is because they have a full stable of authors. They're very unlikely to be looking for new authors. And that's why it is important to try and research a bit more and look for the younger agents or editors in publishing houses, because they will be hungry, looking to create their stable. The other big bit of advice I would give for people writing material to be submitted to agents and authors is, so you must remember that, so we are all reading an enormous amount of material, and we're also sitting there reading this enormous amount of material with the express hope that every single manuscript we pick up is going to be, the next, Eleanor Oliphant, and so we're sitting there anxious for the thing that we're about to read to be that book. So we're an audience who's willing you on to be successful. If you're opening, let's say you're opening 30 or 40 pages, does not grab the person who's willing you on straight away, it is unlikely that it's going to grab the attention of someone who's browsing in a bookstore looking for something to read, because what they will do is pick up a book, look at the cover, look at the back cover, probably open the book, look at the size of the print of the text to decide whether they then have a look and read the first few pages and see whether they get hooked. So really, it's very, very important as a creative writer that those first few pages, I would say the first 20 to 30 pages, is really impactful in whatever way you can make it. And that's how you're going to stand out. And actually, I'm going to be really honest with you, almost everyone, what happens is you read the first 30 or 40 pages, you then decide whether you're going to put that aside because it's not working for you, because you can't read every single manuscript through to the end. So you have to start filtering, and that first filter is based on those first 30 pages or so. So you won't get over the first hurdle if you haven't figured that out. So yeah, that's my big piece of advice about it.
I'm the sucker who also goes to chapter 2 just in case they were having a hard time with chapter 1, and maybe it got better.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Because sometimes starting a novel is the hardest part.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
There's a question about translation. What are the differences between working with translation versus regular publishing?
Well, I guess there's probably is there 2 parts to this question? Because I mean, Jeremy can probably speak to buying text in translation or to be translated into English. But in terms of me just selling for translation, it's the publisher in the translated market takes care of hiring a translator and finding the right person. In terms of what they end up looking for is a book that needs to be, specific, that they know is good. They can publish a translated author well in Italy or France. So again, that comes down to subject matter and writing. There's no clear thing about what works, actually, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. What I would say is often, particularly when you go to Frankfurt and the London Book Fair, you'll be hearing, as a publisher, from foreign publishers from, let's say, Sweden or Italy or France, who are pitching books to you. Their rights directors in their publishing houses are trying to sell you English language rights in books that they've published in Sweden or France or Italy. The first problem is, so you will listen to the pitch and you'll listen to whether the pitch sounds intriguing. You then have a problem of trying to find a reader who can read the book for you, who knows the language, can read the book for you and give you a report on it, which is unbiased, i.e. not from the person trying to sell it to you. And then finally, if you decide to buy the book, finding a translator who is experienced enough to translate it into something that's really brilliantly publishable. Weirdly, that sounds like an awful lot of hurdles, but translated fiction is now more and more successful than it ever has been. And there's a lot of there's a lot of huge best-selling translated titles now. So it's a thing. It's complicated, but we do all do it, and we find our way through. But I would say it's the idea of the book that is the most important thing there. The idea of it, because that's going to be the thing that triggers the editor to get a reader's report and go through all that process. It becomes complicated if it then becomes a hot auction because everyone's intrigued by the idea, because then you don't have time to get that reader's report or get someone to read it for you. So you then have to take a risky decision as to whether to go for it, and you will base that decision on what's happened in the home markets, whether it's sold anywhere else, whether other publishers are talking about it around the world. And yeah, it's complicated, but it works.
Right. Which I think kind of answers the question about whether you should try and translate the text into English or not. Certainly the pitch and so on, but
absolutely, yeah. If you can translate a few chapters, that would be great. Although be sure it's a good translation, because if it's a really bad translation, it could actually turn the English publisher, the English language publisher, off. It could have the opposite effect.
Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap up and think about this question about the future a little bit and the impact of COVID. And I want to backtrack a little bit on our discussion, because it seems to me the example of your two careers, putting to one side for a moment the issue of the English degree as such. But it seems to me, from listening to what you've said in your two careers, that actually publishing is a career area that actually you do need to know quite a lot about before you begin to approach. And you might think you know quite a lot about it if you like books, but actually there's a tremendous amount more to it than that. And as you mentioned, Jeremy, Kingston has got a degree program in publishing, and that is an applied program which is designed to introduce people to the industry, to prepare them for careers in that industry, to let them know what the different functions within the industry are, and to try and transfer to them some of the skills that are needed to maybe make sure that that initial approach, as we've talked about the opening letter, but also the content on the CV and the way in which they might use their time in social media, online and in other places, most constructively in order to get in. And getting in can mean, as you also said, I think both of you, this is a wide-ranging industry. There are a lot of agents with a lot of different interests. There are a lot of publishers, with some with tiny, very specific lists. So it's a broad area of different possibilities and opportunities. And to really get to know that, you could be that, like in many professions, a professional qualification in the area, particularly in a time as we're coming up to with a prolonged depression, there are going to be fewer jobs out there, that actually spending time doing a publishing qualification could actually be time very well spent in preparing for when we hope, as you said, Kate, there'd be some kind of economic recovery coming and there'd be more hires in publishing, or more of a self-publishing, self-starting kind of environment where people are freelancing more. So I suppose my final question is, in the post-COVID world, a publishing qualification seems to me to be a huge advantage. But what other shapes in the post-COVID world will we see differently? And what do you think the most important things people should be looking for to be successful in publishing in that post-COVID environment when we hopefully build back better? Kate, what do you think?
I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the past year is that we've been able to work remotely, and we've all, as either you're an agency or a publishing house, have been able to kind of keep those internal communications strong and cohesive and fluid, and be able to go about our jobs. So it's very much realizing that actually you don't need to be London based anymore to be hired or to work at anywhere. And I think that's been probably one of the huge bonuses, I think, in hopefully opening up the industry, beyond obviously London, but also diversity wise. We know that London is an extremely expensive city to live in, so I think hopefully one of the positives is that that kind of barrier will help be removed. I think that's probably the biggest change I'm hoping to see. And I know, I don't know, I mean, there's other publishing houses. I don't know if you guys have actually, Jeremy, but, HarperCollins or Hachette are really specifically looking to start opening publishing houses and divisions outside of London. So again, to have it more spread out throughout the country and not concentrated here, which I think is huge.
Exactly.
That's very
yes. I mean, I wondered because they announced those before these lockdowns happen, and I'm wondering whether, because in a sense you don't. What it's teaching us is we don't need buildings, and what they've done is they've rented buildings in Manchester and places in order to move there. And actually, I think lockdown means you don't really need to have the buildings. I think that's going to be one of the interesting things. Where we moved into a new building in September 2019 in Farringdon, and we're already talking about how we might use that building in different ways, because it's very obvious that we're going to go back into a hybrid world of people working at home much more. But also as I talked about earlier, this is an industry that relies on relationships and communication and talking. And one thing we are missing is the thing of the serendipitous conversations with colleagues around the building as you go about. It's a bit like Frankfurt. When you go to Frankfurt, you go to Frankfurt and you have meetings every half hour, which are sort of in your diary. But what I've always found is that my most interesting and successful meetings at Frankfurt are when I'm rushing from one meeting to another, and I'm in a corridor rushing, and I bump into someone and they say, "Oh, have you heard about this book from Russia? Go over to stand number blah and you'll meet the policewoman who's writing a 10-book crime series based in Russia." We need to keep that going. So I think we will still have buildings and we will still be using them, but it'll be much more work at home. And already we've got a lot of our not a lot of our staff, but a proportion of our staff have already asked if they can move out of London because of the prices and work, and there's no reason to say no. So that should clear up. I think the other thing that's really clear is that this has given an enormous. So publishing hasn't actually suffered during lockdown. It's been one of the industries that has actually thrived, bizarrely, even though we didn't think it would at the beginning. And it's partly because of Amazon and the fact of books being able to be delivered to your door, partly because of digital, and also partly because the bookstores have become, particularly the independents, have become incredibly creative about ways of dealing with it. I would say that there's something around that, something around digital in particular. So digital is already about 20% of anyone's sales at the moment. I suspect digital will become a bigger, particularly audio as well, will become a bigger part of things, and I suspect that will mean that there will be a change in the work processes, because you can approach digital in a totally different way to physical publishing. Physical publishing is constrained by the physical market. Digital publishing isn't. And so there's all sorts of things like iterative text. So you publish a book, but the text is correctable all the time after you've published it, and you can play around with it and change the ending and see if that increases your sales. So there's all sorts of things to do, and I think the digital-only imprints that arose a few years ago that have been snapped up by the big houses, I think that sort of publishing is going to increase, and people who have those skills, will be much sought after, I think.
Lots of industries are, if they're not getting rid of their offices completely, are devolving to much more freelance and flexible systems and flexible working from home, but also using a lot more freelance, a lot more people on portfolio careers, even than there were before. Do you think in the big publishing, I mean, that already happens a lot in the smaller publishing houses. Do you think that's going to come to the bigger publishing houses? So there'll be fewer central office jobs, but more freelance and consultancy and
to be honest, it's happening already. I mean, it has to, because we're publishing across a very broad range of areas, and you can't have experts. You can't have in your overheads experts in all these areas, and so particularly with publicity, for instance, or editing, we buy in the people that we need who are specialists in particular areas to do that work. So and that's becoming more and more of a thing.
Right.
So absolutely, yeah.
So again, getting a qualification like a publishing degree, and then
absolutely,
presenting yourself online, your skill set, and then competing for those jobs, both here and internationally. These websites around the world are picking people up to do jobs. The rates aren't necessarily great, but that may be part of just the shape of a freelance future. And Kate, in the agenting world, what's going to happen?
I was going to say, I actually, I almost forgot that I did this for a while. I had gotten a copy editing qualification a lifetime ago and was able to do freelance copy editing, which is actually, again, something at copy editing and proofreading. I mean, I know not all publishing houses do that in-house for every single title. I mean, there are, that is a kind of a freelance job. I mean, I think for agenting, we're so much more flexible. In terms of how we work already. I mean, we have an office that we use, but rarely was the day that we were all there anyway, because we were always out at meetings with our authors, with publishers, and things like that. So actually what we've realized that we need is really a really core administrative staff. So that's something that we've been building on, and the way that we work at Green and Heaton, we always, the more you learn, we're happy for you to keep doing more work. And if agenting ends up being your passion, we will help you get there. And it's about learning first, I think, all the baseline skills that need to be an agent. But yeah, I think in those administrative roles too, like our new assistant, I mean, she's working remotely, and she might not ever come into the office. It just feels also very strange to have this employee that we've never actually met in person. But I see her every day, so.
Okay, well, I'm going to draw this to a close. We'll leave the lines open, as they say, so that anybody else who would like to share their contact details, and we'll set up a WhatsApp group so we can continue this conversation. A lot of people were saying in the chat, they wanted to share resources, they wanted to get stuff online, they wanted to know what kind of websites people were accessing. They wanted to stalk Kate and Jeremy digitally to get a job from either of them, or both, preferably. But we can keep that discussion going via the WhatsApp group, and if anybody wants to share anything through that route. But from me, thank you both very, very much. Really, absolutely fascinating discussion.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And Meg, Meg, I can send you some websites I know that we look for when we're hiring and all that stuff.
That's fantastic. I can put all that information in the chat, and then also we will start up the, as you said, a WhatsApp group, and keep you all in touch. We have a second of these events, and everyone who's come along to this one will be invited to the next. And that will be on the 10th of March at the same time. It's again a Wednesday evening, and that will be with 3 of our industry board people. So one is Asha Jalani, who is the head of marketing and communications for the International Federation of Consulting Engineers. But in addition to that work, she's done much work in terms of policy development, public affairs within UK government. So it's a very different kind of industry in which writing skills are extremely useful. Likewise, John Tomlinson, who's currently head of leadership development at the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So using skills in terms of diplomacy, using your writing skills in that industry. And Brian Bravati also will be part of that conversation, talking about his own international development work and how he uses his writing skills in order to make a career in international development and human rights work. So thank you all very, very much. If you have further questions, you can put them in the chat, and I can put them separately to Kate and Jeremy in emails to them. Come back to you.
Sure.
Perfect.
Thank you all so much. Love to see you.
Thanks,
Great to see you,
guys. Have a nice night.
Real life
yeah.
soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.